For more than 2 decades now, Lawrence Stone has had a reputation as one of the most productive and exciting of the historians writing about early modern England. He spent his early career in Oxford, and since 1963 has been the Dodge Professor of History at the University of Princeton in the United States. Since 1968, he's also been director of the Shelby Cullum Davis Center for Historical Studies. Professor Stone, your first book was on medieval sculpture, published in 1955. And although you've ranged fairly widely since then and have always been willing to step outside geographical and chronological frontiers, for the most part your work has been associated with England in the 16th and 17th centuries. What was it that first drew you to this particular period of English history?
Well, you're quite right. I was supposed to be a medievalist. I was trained as a medievalist. My headmaster, Sir Robert Burley, Charterhouse, taught me as a medievalist. I went to Christ Church and started reading medieval history with Noel Mars. As my special subject, I did the Third Crusade with John Prestwich, so everything was set to be a medievalist. And then I hit the early modern period, and I started reading the works of Tawney, and it became clear to me that the central questions I was interested in was the transition from medieval feudalism to modern capitalist society, and modern politics, law, and so on. And if I want to do that, this is where the action was in the early modern period, and that fixed me. And it's the works of Tawney, I think, which did it. Secondly, it struck me that it was, if you want to find out when England becomes different from the continent of Europe, it is this early modern period when it begins to drift away in all phases of its life. And thirdly, I realized by hit or miss and trial and error that the data I wanted in the medieval period was too inadequate really to understand how people felt. You had very little personal letters, personal documentation, love letters, things of this sort. You simply couldn't understand what made them tick. Whereas in the early modern period, you could. Literacy was advancing, people were writing to one another, and they had survived. So those things, I think, just sucked me.
Well, from that point onwards, it was something like 17 or 18 years before the publication of The Crisis of the Aristocracy, in which you obviously did a great deal of research. Why did you decide to go about studying the aristocracy so completely? It's partly an argument about the English Civil War, but it's also a total portrait of a social group. Why did you decide to approach it in this extraordinarily broad and, for the time, very unusual way?
Well, that's a hard question. I think I drifted into it. I simply discovered this vast mass of archives, untouched, untapped, which had suddenly become available through the dissolution of these great country houses. They deposited their archives in local record offices, or they were suddenly making them available to scholars. And I just hit it. That's one reason, is simply that the data overwhelmed me. You should also remember that my first book, which everybody always forgets, was a biography of Horatio Bellaficino, and I was ranging fairly widely in different aspects of this human being. So I'd always been interested in this. Thirdly, I read people like Lucien Febvre and Marc Bloch and the French Annales school. And these things just pulled me in different directions. And I decided I had to work on problems of power, on problems of the family, on problems of education, problems of religion, etc., if I was going to do a composite picture. And I had this wild ambition to do a total portrait of a class, which I thought was possible because I kept the class sufficiently small to make it doable. I went into this thing with the idea that the main crisis was a financial crisis and that the aristocracy was in deep financial trouble in 1640 when the revolution broke out. I then discovered halfway through this simply wasn't true. What happened was it was only a temporary crisis. It was lasted the whole of the reign of Elizabeth for a variety of reasons. By the early 17th century, they were coming out of this economic trough, and by the 1640, they were economically in pretty good shape. But what it seemed to me was happening was that they simply hadn't yet found themselves a proper political role to replace the medieval, feudal, military role which they had played originally, and that their efforts to get themselves out of the economic trap, which meant raising rents, throwing people off the land, maximizing profits, was decreasing their status and their influence over their tenants and in the eyes of everybody at large.
In terms of the political crisis, the crisis of authority, a number of historians in recent years have begun suggesting that the aristocracy, or rather one should say specifically the House of Lords, was still exercising considerably more influence than was thought until very recently. Do you have a view on these recent revisionist arguments?
Yes, I'm afraid I don't buy them at all. It does seem to me sort of neo-Namierism being fed back into the 17th century where it doesn't fit. Is applying Namier's interpretation of the role of the aristocracy in the 1760s and applying it to the period of the 1630s and 1640s. I mean, these arguments that people like John Pym were simply satellites and toadies and acolytes of great magnates simply doesn't seem to me to hold up. They are independent men, they're saying their own thing. They are, of course, dependent on patronage for election, that's no question about that. But the central questions you have to ask yourself is, first of all, why is it that the House of Commons becomes the centre of political activity, not the House of Lords? And that we now know much more about that, and it's the House of Commons speeches which are being circulated and distributed, and people are reading them widely and passing them around, not House of Lords speeches. And when the chips are down, it's the House of Commons, or the majority, substantial majority of the House of Commons, who take on the King and a substantial majority of the House of Lords in a civil war and beat them. And this has never happened in history before. It seems to me that there's evidence of military weakness and political weakness of the members of the House of Lords and the House of Lords as an institution.
What do you think was the, if there is a single fundamental reason, what was the basic reason that the squirearchy were able to assume leadership on the eve of the Civil War?
Well, I think partly they're filling a vacuum. That the English Church had blotted its copybook hopelessly with Archbishop Laud. Laudian's Arminianism was obviously deeply unpopular and even shocking to many devout Anglicans who thought it was on the edge of popery. The king was increasingly unpopular. He was cold. He was resistant to any appeals for compromise. And he was treacherous, and everybody knew that. And the circulation of all these pamphlets and these poems, scurrilous poems and things, I think, prove this. Into this vacuum poured a group of very, very talented, legally trained, highly educated, wealthy, ambitious, experienced administrators, like people like Pym and his associates, who it seems to me filled this vacuum and took over in the first 2 or 3 years of the war.
Would you accept that the aristocracy reasserted themselves pretty effectively after 1660?
Oh, very. I mean, their comeback is extraordinary. And by the 1670s, 1680s, they're battening on the economic prosperity which is coming their way. They had reorganized their estates, they had modernized. Although rents were flagging and stabilizing right through the late 17th century, their income seems to be going up. They were marrying heiresses very, very fast, and therefore piling up more and more land, more and more capital. They were using their money, learning to use their money to influence the voting processes as the Whig-Tory split developed, and they were manipulating the electorate in this way. They were obtaining control and using it of the patronage of the church and the state to put their own nominees in. And they were cooperating with squires in the Whig party and the Tory party to seize political power at the centre. It seems to me you can see them taking off.
Cooperating with squires, you say. You don't see the squirearchy as being effectively pushed out post?
No, I don't think so. I think it is a cooperation. If they hadn't cooperated with the squires and they hadn't cooperated with the great banking communities after the founding of the Bank of England and these great East India Company, Levant Company and so on, these were the critical new levers of power in England, and the aristocracy, very skillfully, it seems to me, cooperated with them, adapted their policies to match these interests, and at the same time themselves staying on top of the situation and indeed hogging most of the profits by sinecure offices and military offices and things of this sort.
To what extent did the crisis of the aristocracy, by its very range, provide, as it were, a springboard into the rest of your career as a historian? It could be said that many of the things that you've pursued since that sprang directly from that book, or were you following up loose ends, as it were?
Yes, I think it was these rather skimpy chapters on these various problems of the family, problems of education and so on, which I decided were inadequate and had to be looked at in greater depth, which stirred me up to have a look at them. These questions had always been on my mind from the start, but it is working on them through the crisis, and my sense that further exploration was badly needed, which pushed me into this exploration of particularly education and the family, and also a desire to push into the 18th century. It seemed to me that this cut-off point of 1660, which we were all doing at that time, was inadequate. We really had to push on and see the rest of the story up towards the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, you've very much done that with your most recent book, An Open Elite. Your argument concerning the relative stability of the elite is focused on the later 17th and 18th century. To that extent, you very much did what you wanted to do in moving forward in time. And yet you do still seem to hold to the position that the late 16th and early 17th centuries had been a period of unprecedented mobility.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think the dissolution of the monasteries in itself, opening up maybe a quarter of the total land area of England for grabs, simply shook the society to its roots, the creation of the nation-state and the centralization of power in the central state, the reorganization of the Church of England, all these things simply shook up society, and it was a period of a great social mobility. If you compare the speed of change then to the speed of change, as far as I could see in this latest study later on, it is a period of great change. And the 1660 to 1880 is a period of extraordinary stability.
But I suppose one of the central problems with any work of this kind is that, as you suggest in An Open Elite, there's the problem of how much is a lot. You show at various times in different counties between 10 and 20% turnover in particular generations of elite families. Could it not be said that that is in fact quite a lot?
Well, it could, and I do pose this question. It's an unanswerable one, as we all know, and different people can come to different conclusions. My own position is that there's no such thing as a totally closed elite. It virtually does not exist outside the Venetian oligarchy, perhaps. Even in the Indian caste systems, demography inevitably creates mobility of a sort. So you're going to have maybe 5, 10%, whatever happens. In addition to which, the only area where we found a very high mobility was very close to London, in Hertfordshire, just outside London, not elsewhere. And even that, if you look at it even more closely, what you find is that people were moving in and out. There was a rotating stream moving in, moving out, whereas a solid core of old families is hanging on generation after generation after generation, and not budging at all.
Do you think that would be equally true of the lesser gentry? I mean, again, in the book you do say that you would be prepared to consider the possibility that there was much more mobility at the bottom end of gentle society. And some studies, like B.G. Blackwood's study of Lancashire, for example, suggest a considerable amount of turnover at various points in the 17th century. Perhaps the myth was describing an experience which was that of the prosperous professional lower gentry level.
No, I think there's no question that at the gentry level the mobility must have been much greater. On the other hand, if you look at, as I say, these urban studies and see how few people seem to be moving out of the urban situation, my guess is that these new men moving in are upwardly mobile yeomen from landed classes and professional men, lawyers, doctors, government officials, which means it is absolutely no different than anywhere else in Europe.
If we go back a little to the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the period which you, along with many others, see as the period of drastic change, perhaps we can take up the question of the educational revolution from your 1964 article. Do you still stand by the notion of an educational revolution of the late 16th and early 17th centuries?
Yes, I think everything that's been published since has tended to confirm this fact.
But do you think we yet have a satisfactory explanation of why the gentry in particular began to transform their educational requirements?
No, we don't. I think that is a puzzle. You can argue, what was the point of Latin? Why do you have to struggle with Latin? Clearly, they were persuaded by Erasmus and the humanists that a gentleman, if you wanted to be a gentleman, you must be able to read and speak Latin. It seems to be a status qualification that you had to have. Also, I think it's partly due to the fact that these landed classes were having to adapt themselves from being a military warrior aristocracy to an administrative aristocracy. They had to get an education which would be suitable for administration. And that meant modern languages, political science, history, things of this sort.
How much of it is just fashion, do you think?
I think a lot of it's fashion because it seems to ebb in the post-1660 period. But, on the other hand, if you turn to literacy, the graph keeps moving steadily upwards.
Yeah. There are those, even those who've gone to a great deal of trouble to document the rise of popular literacy, have sometimes been very sceptical about whether it had any practical consequences of great significance. But what do you think about that?
Well, I'm torn. I really am torn. For a long time I thought it was tremendously important and revolutionized the world and so on. Then I began to wonder, what the hell difference does it mean if you can read and write? And today we're moving into a society where communication is much more oral. We're learning things through television and visual aids rather than through books. And how much is this going to affect the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we look at ourselves? On the other hand, you can say that reading is a very private, a very personal thing which creates introspection, creates inwardness, if you like. You are alone with this printed word and you're communicating with the past and with the author. And you can also say, I think, with some justification, that the Reformation would simply have never got off the ground without literacy. It was the reading of the Bible which created a Protestant, the possibility of Protestantism. It certainly created Puritanism. Without Puritanism there would have been, without literacy there would have been no Puritanism. The tie-in between the reading the Bible and Puritanism seems to be a very, very tight one. The level of movement is just not possible without the pamphlet literature of the Civil War period, in which allegedly tens of thousands were being published and being read. So in that sense, very central aspects of English life were being governed by this literacy.
You've written a great deal about the English Revolution, either directly or indirectly. To what extent does it form a central series of events in your whole conception of the early modern period?
I think this is, I always have thought, this is absolutely central. It's in my view, the first of the so-called great revolutions of the world. If you regard the French Revolution as the second, and the Russian Revolution as the third, and then the Chinese, and so on. A great revolution in the sense that everything was up for grabs. The whole religious structure was up for grabs, the political structure was up for grabs. A king was not only executed, but the monarchy was abolished, the House of Lords was abolished, and every possible radical thought that anybody's thought ever since can be found somewhere in the period 1640, 1660, if you look for it. Maybe only half a dozen people read it, but it's there somewhere. I mean, there's an extraordinary explosion of radical thinking. So I think it's one of the great central episodes of the Western world, therefore. And although you can say that in political terms and in terms of social structure and total economic structure, the effects were not very great. I think that is true. Nevertheless, it did provide a conspectus of views about the church. It entrenched the dissenting element, could never be dislodged ever again in English history. They were embedded in the towns by 1660. They couldn't be got out of it. So that you had a religious plurality. It was a religiously pluralistic society. There was no hope of ever going back on that. And I think the ideas of the contract state, as elucidated by Locke and finally accepted in the 18th century, arose out of the contract theories of this revolution. So in that sense, both politics and religion were permanently affected by what went on then. So I really do think it's a very, very central episode, even if, as I admit, the social consequences, economic consequences were not very great, and that if you look at it in the long-term ideological perspective and moral perspectives, you can say that the main results were actually the reverse. That is to say, it ushered in a huge century and a half of conservatism. We mustn't change anything. If we touch anything, we're liable to get this explosion again, which it seems to me held up reform of English institutions until the Victorian period. So in that sense, it was very negative.
You're one of the few people who's written quite extensively on the question of the results of it all. People obviously are much more preoccupied with the causes. At the moment, there seem to be two positions. One, that there were no particular long-term causes, that the whole thing was an almost accidental breakdown, short-term. The other being a removal back to the notion that there was one dominant cause, which is now being traced to religion, the revival of the Puritan Revolution idea. Do you still stand by your own rather more complex view, the argument that there was what you called a multiple dysfunction in English society and politics, which can be traced back over a century and should be, to explain these events?
Without the Shop Tone Conference, there would have been no civil war. It was absolutely clear. Without the folly of idiocy of Charles and obduracy of Laud and things of this sort, accidents like the Irish Rebellion, the Civil War wouldn't have broken out in the first place. I concede that, and I've always said that. But on the other hand, it does seem to me these people who are obsessed with these short-term causes of intimate political debate in a 1 year or another year are so deep in the wood that all they can see is the trees. If you're in the middle of a wood, all you see is trees. And it's hardly surprising they can't see anything else. And the classic example of this, it seems to me, is Fletcher's superb book, which is an analysis of 1640-42 leading up to the Civil War. He does a beautiful chronology, shows how it happens. He demonstrates something very important, which was a massive input from the yeoman upwards by petitioning about national issues to the state. And then he says, when it's all over, well, what caused the Civil War? He says, well, they just didn't trust one another. Well, big deal. But he is incapable of explaining why they didn't trust one another, because his framework is so narrow to this 2 years, he can't do it. Yeah. If you want to know, for example, almost any problem, if you want to know anything about religion, you've got to go back to the Reformation. If you want to know about the Puritans, they are not comprehensible except in terms of the failure of the Reformation to reform the English church, to reform society, to create a new and better moral and ethical church, which failed. And they emerge out of that failure. You've got to go back there to find it. If you look at politics, you have to explain why Charles I, unlike Louis XIV or Philip IV, had such little power. He had no money, he had no army, and he had no local civil service. And unless you, to explain those three things, you have to go way, way back to Henry VIII or even before to explain them. If you want to look at another question of why both sides in these disputes before the Civil War were obsessed with the law, they were legalistic, they were absolutely obsessed with the law. Well, to explain that, you've got to go back to the 14th century. I divided the course into long-term, then precipitants, and then triggers. The precipitants I started at 1629 with the dissolution of Parliament and Charles's autocracy. Today I think I would start at 1625-26 with the real breakdown, it seems to me, of relations between King and Parliament, particularly over the forced loan and things of that sort. I think they have convinced me that the precipitants begin with Charles. Charles really was a catalyst. He was so obstinate and he was so hostile to Parliament and he was so irresponsible that things really started going wrong very badly. And I would therefore transfer the beginnings of the precipitants back to 25. That's the only thing I would do.
That's interesting. It could be said that one sticking point, arguing for an incompatibility between your views and some revisionist views, would be that you did argue in the courses of the English Revolution that there was a rise of opposition as a self-conscious political force. Now that's a particular concept which has been repeatedly rejected by these political historians. Again, would you still stand by that, or would you modify that position?
I don't think there's such a thing as the opposition. I do think there was such a thing as opposition. People who are coming up to London, to Parliament, and say we are the country, and we're looking after the interests of the country, which is not the same as the interests of the court. And therefore, that the interests of the king and his courtiers is not the same as the interests of the nation as a whole. Now that, it seems to me, once you're in that position, you are in a conflict situation. Whereas Elizabeth had been the embodiment of English nationalism and everything that was grand and glorious about England, James and Charles were incapable of taking on that role. And conflict, beneath the veneer of a rhetoric of consensus, it seems to me, is very clear.
So you don't feel that the English Civil War, to some extent, distorts the historiography of the 17th century?
You're absolutely right, that the way we divided English social history with torn is century, 1540, 1640, when we stopped, bang, and we never looked beyond, has done endless damage.
Well, you've crossed the divide more than most, and not least in the question of the history of the family. Which is, do you think now, looking back, that in your interpretative chapters and summations and conclusions, you perhaps went too far in presenting a firm schema of change?
Yes. I think I made two major mistakes. One was to over-schematize as you say, which was not supported by the evidence, which does suggest much slower and more hesitant and more ambiguous transformations. The trouble is with family history, you know as well as I do, is that there are as many family structures and patterns and modes of behavior as there are families pretty well, and one family living next door to another one may behave in quite different ways, which makes it such absolute hell to produce any overarching model. If I were a more cautious person, I wouldn't have been stuck my neck out like this, and I wouldn't have over-schematized the way I did. But I did give people a target to shoot at, which I think may have been helpful. But the other much more serious mistake was that I was generalizing primarily from the upper and upper middle classes to the poor. I do now know about the poor, and it's perfectly clear that my model of the poor was quite wrong.
Is there any real hope, do you think, of writing a single history of the English family?
Well, yes and no. I think their stratified diffusion still holds, but I only think it holds to the middle and upper classes, as I say. If this concept of affective individualism, which I was trying to push, as something emerging in the late 17th, early 18th century and then spreading. It does, I can first see it in people like Daniel Defoe and dissenting London elements in the late 17th, early 18th century. I then can see it spreading to the gentry, and then I think it's fairly clear it spreads to the aristocracy. This is, I think, intellectual movements, humanitarian, intellectual, romanticism, novels, all sorts of things of this sort. And I do think it is being diffused upward through the social system. You go down below that, and I think, as I say, you have a very long continuity of relatively free marital patterns and marital behaviors, with parents reacting to this in very, very different ways. I mean, some very brutal parents who are being absolutely tyrannical to their children, and some being very extremely permissive, but far more permissive than I ever expected. So I would still hold to this diffusion with high intellectual ideas behind it, from the middle class upwards, but I don't think it works down below.
The problem at the moment with the history of the family seems to be to find ways of handling change. But is there also a problem of having the correct kind of time scheme within which to deal with it?
I think that's right. It's perfectly clear that if you stick to a generation or two generations, which historians normally do, this won't do. I do think that change, when it occurs, is very, very slow, particularly amongst the lower classes. And if you want to see it functioning, we have to take it at least 200, 250 year spans in order to perceive anything significant happening.
One of the most fundamental changes which you saw arising over a period of 2 to 3 generations is the rise of affect. You said quite openly in The Family, Sex and Marriage that you found it exceedingly difficult how to explain this shift in the range of people's sympathies, as it were. Are you able to define it more closely now, or explain it?
I can't define it more closely. I think what I would stress seemed to me a humanitarian sensibility and hostility to cruelty. If you look at it, you see an end of torturing people in England in the middle of the 17th century, an end of burning heretics, end of burning witches, end of burning alive, anyway, wives who poison their husbands, they're strangled before they... public executions are moved to inside the prisons. Romanticism is hooked into it.
One thing that you haven't written a great deal about, though you constantly mention it, is religion. Why is this? Why have you never gone frontally into questions of religious change?
Well, there are limits to the... I've obviously recognized the enormous importance of religion. I am myself an agnostic, so I never had a religious experience in my life, so I can't treat it from inside. But I have to talk about it. And indeed, in my undergraduate lecture courses, which run from 1480 to 1720 or thereabouts, about a third of the course is devoted, has to be, to religion, to the Reformation and to Protestantism and to Puritanism and dissent, anti-popery, and so on. And I have to deal with it as best I can.
I have a reputation for bold argument and clear conceptualization. Inevitably, that brings controversy. To that extent, you almost deliberately caught it. But why do you prefer this style of operation?
It seems to me how history works in two ways. One is posing broad ideas and then niggling and testing them, refining them, and saying this isn't right, we have to change it in this way. That, I think, as I understand it, occurs in every science, whether it's physics or biology or history or whatever. And I've always preferred the the bold and perhaps foolhardy generalizations simply to stimulate work and get it going. And that, as I suppose, is a temperamental, built-in temperamental bias. Obviously, and inevitably, always, the work attracts the attention of detailed researchers, graduate students go and do doctoral dissertations, and the thing gets chipped away, and sometimes it disappears altogether, like my model of the working class family. I don't mind that. I do have a dislike, which is probably a weakness, I think, of ambiguity. I really hate ambiguity. And I realize the world is full of, we live in an ambiguous world, and we're constantly in conflict and ambiguity. But nevertheless, I'm very irritated by books which at the end of it I say, what the hell has that man said? I can't understand that he's really said anything. He said two things, and he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. I don't like that. So I've always tried to be clear, and I've always tried to be so that everybody can understand exactly what it is I'm saying. But that, of course, inevitably leads to oversimplification. It leads to exaggeration. And if you're out front in the field doing it rather pioneering, you're going to be proved wrong. And I'm sure a lot of what I've said over time is going to be proved wrong. Some of it, I hope, will be proved right.
How do you go about setting a project up then, when you've got an idea which you want to follow through? Do you have a method that you usually follow?
Well, I don't think I do anything very different from anybody else. I read all the secondary literature. I then look around for archival material or primary material and just plunge myself into it for as many years as it requires to come up with some plausible hypothesis of my own. I've also I poke around in the social sciences. One of the influences on me, obviously, is moving to America, where the social sciences were much more powerful than in England. I was very influenced, first of all, by sociology, by particularly R.K. Merton, and then by political science, particularly theories of revolution, was very important, obviously, in my analysis of the English Revolution. And theories of modernization, although they're vastly oversimplified in the American scene, I still think it contains a kernel of truth that something fundamental does change, which can be called modernization as we move into the modern world. Those two things have been very important. And then more recently, of course, being in close cohabitation with Clifford Geertz and symbolic anthropology, which also has influenced my thinking, not as much as some of my other colleagues at Princeton.
You seem to draw very eclectically on all of this.
Yes, I'm a grave robber. I like to. I don't think there's anything wicked in just going into a different field and with a pickaxe and digging out the gold and getting out fast. If it's useful to you, then use it.
Could I ask you about how you write? Do you write fast? Do you plan very carefully?
I write very fast. I write a first draft very, very fast indeed, and then I tinker and tinker and tinker and tinker. And it used to be very difficult for me because every time I tinker, it has some poor person, usually a woman, has to retype it, either my wife or my secretary or somebody here or something. And by about the 15th rewriting, one begins to ask oneself, can one possibly ask one's wife or one's secretary to do it? Now my life has been transformed with a word processor, and one can tinker forever.
Do you have any views about the teaching of history, the ways in which it should be taught?
Not really. The essential thing is to make it interesting, and that depends on the human personality, I think. Nothing is worse than boring history. It just drives people away from the field and they don't touch it.
You said, this is perhaps our last question, that history is a moral as well as an intellectual task. But what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I don't think that history has much purpose and you can make much of it unless you have some vision of a moral universe in this world at this present time which you're prepared to use in the past. Now, I don't mean to say the old-fashioned doctrine, which is that history is the evidence of God's work in the world. It seems to me history is a story of absolute horror, in which the bad guys nearly always win, the good guys nearly always lose, and on the whole it's an atrocious story. But it does seem to me that if one is working on the past, one should be free to make moral judgments about human beings in the past. I'm prepared to do so. It does seem to me that a democratic law-based society is better than a tyranny. Nowadays, historians, English historians particularly, seem to me terrified of saying anything like that. Always up to us to make moral judgments, they say. I think that's wrong. I think we do have an obligation to society and to our readers to make it clear where we stand. I'm an old-fashioned Whig and liberal, and I don't think I ever make any bones about where I stand on these matters. I think if you parade your moral views in your works, as some people do, I think that's upsetting and jars on the nerves. But to go into history allegedly without any preconceptions, without any moral bias one way or the other, sort of torture is as good as non-torture or something of this sort, which is what a lot of English historians pretend they do, I think is nonsense. I think they're either killing themselves or killing their readers or both.